Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. This week we are continuing in the 6-week study of Philippians. We're going to be looking at the lesson, Joy of Adversity. And the main thought of this lesson is that believers can face adversity in the joy of knowing the gospel is spread. Well, we have 13 verses in this week's lesson, which is quite a bit, so let's get started. The first couple of verses 12 through 14, we see Paul's situation is seen through the eyes of faith. He actually saw his imprisonment as an open door to share the gospel. To talk about having a positive attitude, he tells the church at Philippi not to worry about him. And why is that? It's because his imprisonment was actually advancing the gospel. For 2 summers, it would be the summers of 1980 and 1981, I worked in natural gas pipeline construction. I know that's hard to believe. And there were 3 main crews on our pipeline construction team. There was the front crew. Okay, they went out front, they well in advance, and it was the most time consuming. They would make temporary gates and fences where the pipeline was going to go through. They removed trees and brush and staked out the path of the pipeline. Then a bulldozer would come through and clear that path for the next group. And that next group was the construction crew. Okay, they would dig the trench, they'd dig the ditch, weld the pipe, wrap the pipe, lay it in the ground. And then the last group to come through was the cleanup crew. They came by and they would backfill the dirt, they smoothed out the path, repaired those gates, and reseeded any grass or pasture. Now, the word Paul used for advancement is a word used to denote the progress of an army, specifically the cutting away of undergrowth, the removal of barriers to allow the advancement of an army, kind of like that front pipeline crew. And that's how he viewed his imprisonment. He was on the forefront of advancement of the gospel. And then he talks about being in chains. And now we shouldn't visualize those heavy chains, that we would use maybe to tow a vehicle. No, these are like short links of chains bound to the wrists of prisoners and a guard. It's kind of similar to handcuffs. So his guard was always right by his side. And of course there was this rotation of guards in the shifts. So while he was in Rome, the whole palace guard knew Paul, knew his story, because the guards were literally a captive audience to him as he preached the gospel to them. So as a result of Paul's being in prison, the gospel was actually being advanced. The palace guards knew his testimony, and his testimony was an encouragement to other Christians who might face trials. Well, how did Paul get into prison? Actually, it was more of a house arrest. How did this happen? Well, if you'd like to do a little bit of background work to be able to tell the story a little bit better succinctly, you can read about Paul's preaching and giving his testimony in Acts chapter 1, starting in verse 27 down through 21. He's arrested, and then he was going to be flogged, and it was discovered he was a Roman citizen. And in chapter 23, Paul appears before the Sanhedrin. Chapter 24, he appears before Felix. Chapter 25, he appears before Festus. And chapter 26, he appears before King Agrippa. And then in chapter 27, he goes to Rome. In chapter 28, verse 30, he's in Rome awaiting trial before Caesar. And it's here where he wrote some of his prison epistles. Now in Philippians 1, verses 15 through 18, we see that Paul rejoiced because Christ was being preached. Now it was true, some were preaching out of envy. So you've probably seen this before when a pastor leads a church or maybe in a secular situation. But when there's a leadership vacuum, someone will try to take power. And at the time Paul's writing this, he's not able to travel freely, of course. He's in prison, he's under house arrest. And that vacuum of him not being available, it appears that some tried to take Paul's place, hence the preaching out of envy. It could be that some were saying that Paul was a failure because he was being imprisoned. If God was with him, he wouldn't be in prison. Which I think that may be what he meant by them stirring up trouble for me while I am in chains. Definitely, there were some folks that had good and pure motives to preach Christ, and regardless, Christ was being preached. And Paul was glad of that. Now, this, of course, does not mean that the ends can justify the means, that we are free to do whatever we need to do, use whatever tactics to get people into church and to get them to make decisions. It doesn't mean that at all. It also doesn't mean that Paul allowed and approved false teaching, because in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, Paul preaches against that. So this preaching must have been doctrinally okay. It was just that maybe their motives for some were different. Now, starting in the last half of verse 18 through verse 19, Paul says, "Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance." Now, the Greek word used for deliverance is the same word that can be also interpreted salvation. Now, yeah, when we're saved, we are delivered from the consequences of sin. So yes, the words can be used interchangeably, but because of the context of what Paul is saying here and the heavy weight that we put on that word salvation or saved, the NIV, the New International Version, uses the word deliverance. Now, other translations, like the King James, uses the word salvation. And of course, Paul doesn't mean that what he's going through is going to help him get into heaven. It doesn't mean that at all. Most scholars believe that he's referring to Job chapter 13, verses 15 and 16, which states this: "Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. Indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance. No godless person would dare come before him." You see, it didn't matter if Paul lived or died, because his stand in Christ would be vindicated. In verse 20, we begin to understand a little bit better about the hope that Paul had. He stated this hope in two ways. He stated it negatively, that he would not be ashamed. Now, when we hear that word ashamed, we think of that feeling of guilt. That's not what Paul meant. A better term here might be to be put to shame. This is similar to the words that he, in Romans chapter 9, verse 33, as he quotes Isaiah there. He says, "As it is written, see, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall, and the one who believes in him will never be put to shame." Okay, he also states this positively, that Christ would be exalted in his body. He doesn't say that I, Paul, will exalt Christ. He doesn't say that, but it would be the Holy Spirit working in Paul that would bring glory to Christ, that would exalt him. So whether his situation led to his release or to his death, Paul was going to remain faithful to Christ. Very similar to those 3 Hebrew children in the fire when they said, our God can deliver us. And even if he doesn't, we will not bow to you, O King. And then we get to that famous verse, verse 21, that states, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." There again, similar to another verse that he wrote to a different church. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, he wrote, "I have been crucified. I'm dead. I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live now, I live in the body. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." You see, Paul's purpose in life was to boldly share Christ and to become more like him. The longer he could live, in spite of the bad circumstances, he would strive to do that. Christ was more than just his helper. He was Paul's life. But if he died, that was even better. He would be with Christ, which was the gain. And this is why Paul did not fear death. Now, I'm sure you've heard it said, and probably have even said it yourself, "Well, I'm still alive. It's certainly better than the alternative." I all know we want to live a long and fruitful life on this earth, but is that really true for a Christian? Shouldn't we have that same mindset as Paul, that we're to live for Christ, and when we die, that's going to be even better because we'll get to be with him? This is why Paul did not fear death. He knew what awaited him on the other side of that last breath. This is a good place to talk about the dot versus the line, illustration I use quite a bit, that Randy Alcorn used in his book, The Treasure Principle. And if you think of all time and eternity as being this one long number line, our life, even if it's 120 years, is just a dot, a tiny dot on that line. And too often we spend way too much time and energy living for that dot instead of for the line. True, now we've got to live in the dot, but what we're doing, we need to be doing for the line, for eternity. So our lives we need to have that long term in mind, not the short term, okay? Not the dot as our focus. That's why Paul wasn't as concerned about being in prison, because he knew it was advancing the gospel. His little short-term inconvenience in the dot was going to be more than made up for in the long term on the line. So, as Galatians 2:20 states, we die to self. If we die to self, it allows Christ to live in and through us. Now, I came across this quote, and I can't find out who originally said it, but here it is. The names of Christians who are honored in history are names that stand over graves where the old man was buried long before the body died. You might want to rewind and listen to that again. That's a pretty good quote. Well, in verses 22 through 24, Paul goes back and forth about what he would choose if he had a choice, life or death. If he remained alive, he would continue to be more fruitful, and there'd be more missionary journeys and more churches planted. But he says that he's torn because he wants to be with Christ face to face, and that's the better alternative. But even though he desires to be with Christ face to face, he thinks that he can still be beneficial to the church in Philippi. Our last couple of verses are verses 25 and 26, where Paul states that he has confidence that he will continue to work with the Philippian church again. Now, we're not for certain that he did, but it was most likely that he was released from his chains and then maybe arrested a few years later, because we can tell from the tone of 2 Timothy, Paul wrote this several years later, that he was more certain of his impending death at that time. He'd run the good race and fought the good fight. Well, this week in your class, can you specifically pray for Christians around the world, especially those in places like Afghanistan, that despite the persecution and even death, they wouldn't give up. They wouldn't give up their hope, that they would continue to find joy in the midst of their awful circumstances. Well, next week we're going to be looking at the first 15 verses of Philippians chapter 2, learning about humbly following Christ in all circumstances. And if you would, please share this YouTube channel with your other teacher friends who happen to use Explore the Bible. I'd appreciate that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to pray for and with your class this week.